Welcome to Beyond the Riverwalk, the local weekly podcast that brings San Antonio's most remarkable people, places, and events directly to you. All links discussed will be in the show notes, so sit back, relax, and join Kevin and Melissa Barron as they ask the questions that you would. Now, let's get the conversation started.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to Beyond the Riverwalk. This is Kevin, and today is a special day at the Alamo when we're recording this. Today is Cannon Fest. If you don't know much about the event called Cannon Fest, well, stay tuned because you're going to find out a little bit more. And obviously, you do know about the Alamo, but we've got two folks here who probably know a little bit more than most of us that are listening, including myself. The first person joining us is Ernesto Rodriguez. He's the Associate Historian at the Alamo, and then also Angela Wolfgram, who's the Director of Living History. So if you would, everybody, just join me in welcoming Ernesto and Angela to the show. So how are you guys doing today?
Good day.
Yeah, doing fine.
Yeah, it's a warm day at the Alamo.
It is.
A nice 90-degree fall day.
Yeah, I was about to say, isn't it supposed to be fall right about now?
That's what we heard.
That's right. Oh, well. Well, we appreciate you doing this. I wanted to find out, I guess, a little bit to start with. What's your background? I mean, it's an unusual thing. There aren't a lot of people in the world that can say that they work at and for the preservation and the future of the Alamo. So can you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves and how you got involved?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I started working here on September 7th of 1999. I was hired by Dr. Peters, and I worked with him all the way up till recently. Background is I have a master's in history, which focuses on Spanish Texas. And there was an opportunity to come to work at the Alamo, and I was lucky enough to be able to get selected, and I've been here ever since.
Yeah, and Angela here. So I have not been working here since 1999. I've just been here for a little over a year, not quite a year and a half. So I'm originally from the Midwest, and my background is in public history. So all about being that connection between academic history, the dissemination of that information, and then, public consumption. So I had previously worked at the Indiana Historical Society in exhibits. Really loved interpretation, just meaning the style in which we're sharing, conveying, doing storytelling. And so the position opened up here in the Living History Department. I just thought I couldn't pass it up. I love living history. I think it's a great vehicle for teaching information, for getting people connected with the material culture, the items of history. And I'm just loving it here. It's an amazing historic site, a huge history, a long history, and just glad to be a part of it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for being here and for being part of this discussion. I'll start, I guess, Angela, just asking you, and this is a question for Ernesto as well. What's your first memory of either hearing about or visiting the Alamo?
Yeah, well, I remember learning about in childhood, Davy Crockett, mainly through pop culture, mainly through, the Disney adaptation. But quite frankly, I feel like in the Midwest, we don't really study the Alamo in great detail, which is definitely a missed opportunity. So it really wasn't until college, and then not until grad school when I actually got to visit here in person, but it wasn't until college when I started to just understand the deeper and richer history here. And then really in the last few years, but then certainly the last year, just information download. I always knew that I was interested in history of the South in general, and you could say Texas is a very different state from the rest of the South. But I have always been interested in the aspects of American history that are different European powers at play and different nations at play in general. I think that's really fascinating. So I've loved in the last year and a half or so, learning about just all the people who laid claim to this area. I find that really fascinating. So it kind of worked mythology in childhood to, learning the actuality of things in the last few years.
Well, for me, I've loved the Alamo since I was a little boy. And I remember coming here when I was young with my mom, my sister, and my cousin. One summer, she said, "We're going to go to the Alamo." And I remember walking in and just enjoying the site, never really thinking I would work here.
Oh.
But I enjoyed Texas history to the point that I went on to study history and at the university level, and that's how I received my master's. But it's one of those stories that, as a native San Antonian, no matter what is happening, it always happens in front of the Alamo. So you always come down here for different events to bring relatives in. And it just so happens that I was lucky enough to get hired, and now I'm here.
But I guess you mentioned, Angela, you mentioned something about just the pop culture side. And one of these things that is always fascinating to me is, what's the difference in perception between what people think they know and what they really know. So I guess to talk a little bit about what you specifically do there, what is a director of living history? What do you do? And then how does that play into actually educating folks about what the true reality is, and maybe multiple realities that they hadn't considered?
Well, the day in and day out is making sure my folks don't faint as they're out in this heat with their long sleeves and their wool.
That's true.
But it's bigger than that. So we have a really neat opportunity here. So many historic sites around the world really have to start on the most basic of levels. When people come to visit, they really have no frame of reference. And so the fact that when people arrive here, they have at least a starting point for what happened and the power of the events here, it ends up being a beautiful jumping off point. Now, a lot of times, we do have to fight against some of the mythology, just because Hollywood in particular will, sometimes kind of change the stories a little bit, have them play out differently to make it more dramatic for the screen. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It just creates a really wonderful opportunity here for us to then talk about the actualities. So one of the wonderful things about living history, and Ernesto's done living history for a long time too, so he could certainly speak to it as well, is that people are understanding, they're finding out from these conversations, from our demonstrations, presentations, the reality of life during, we talk about several time periods, but mainly the 1830s, mainly during the Texas Revolution. And so they're coming here, they're learning about what really happened, what life was like, and that these were human beings. Because I think a lot of times we disconnect that these historical topics happened to real people in an actual time. And so living history just kind of helps us root that knowledge in something. And then we get to really explore a lot of different topics as well. Really kind of is guided by what people are interested in. We have a very much so interactive way of doing things. So if someone walks up to us, sees us tackling some sort of subject, but steers the conversation in another direction, that's okay. And we're ready to go in whatever direction is necessary. And then, one of the coolest things is when people walk away and we've opened up another door of interest for them, and then they get to, go down on the rabbit hole of learning all about Bowie knives or, learning all about Mexican artillery. It could go in any direction. And that's, I think, one of the most special things about living history, but also just the site in general. We get to take that possible mythology people have learned, but certainly kind of the pop culture version of what they've learned, and then really start to add, all of the facts that create a really compelling narrative.
I guess on that note, in talking to Ernesto, you've been doing, or you have done in the past, a living history or reenactments, right? Is that something that you've been interested in for a long time? And how has that contributed to what you do today as a historian?
It helps because being able to talk to somebody, if you lecture someone, it's a verbal, you have a verbal communication. And it's basically one-sided until a question is asked. With living history, you're interacting directly with them. And there's a big difference between a reenactment and a reenactor and a living historian. Living historians are people that want to teach the material culture of the time period and want to explain things. A lot of reenactors were there for the specific event, and they focus just on that event, and they basically talk to each other. And it's one of the important things because you can have a living historian become a reenactor, but it's really hard to get a reenactor to be a living historian. It's this sometimes there's a wall that is built up because they want to just, a lot of times groups just want to talk to each other and hang out with each other and don't want to interact with the general public. So when we do living history, our main focus is the general public. We want to provide them with something they will not get anywhere else and actually interact with them with a communication that is always moving from the living historian to the visitor, and from the visitor to the living historian. So you try to draw them in as much, and it makes it more personal. And people leave with a different understanding. And it's a reason that our living history is so popular, is because they get that closeness to the time period that you don't get from just reading a panel.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining the difference, because that's something I didn't realize. So the way that we're talking about this, we really are focusing on the living history side, because I know in my experience in visiting the Alamo, there are people there that can answer questions and are answering them from not only their knowledge, but from their perspective of, okay, if they're in that setting, if they're in that historical time frame, how would they be thinking? What would they be considering? And that's a whole different thing. I can definitely see what you're saying. So, Thea, thank you for explaining that. When you get into doing living history, and as you have, how did you get into doing that? Was it a natural offshoot of your academic background?
It was natural because here at the Alamo, when I started, Dr. Winters had just begun doing living history, and so he had been in the reenacting community. He had been an educator, and he had been a living historian. So his thing was, let's try to provide another way to teach people. And with a small staff, many of us jumped on board, and we would do our job, and then on weekends do the living history side. And you see a lot of things that occur. And like I said earlier, there's reenactors and there's living historians, and it'll upset people because of the way I say it, but it is true. When you go to a reenactment, a lot of times there'll be maybe one or two guys that'll talk to the public. The rest of them just hang out and talk to themselves and interact with each other because they're trying to remain fully immersed in the event. You're at a living history site. The living historians talk to the general public and very seldomly talk to each other unless they have to. And it's because their focus is different. You don't need to educate your colleague. You need to educate the person that just came from anywhere in the world and has a question about why you're wearing a bag and carrying a rifle. And, you actually just talk to them specifically about that part, and it's one-on-one. And so being in a small department, we would have to do that a lot. So we did a lot of things that were really, really fun. That's what I can say. From fire starting with the public to firing demonstrations to and cooking food. Them. Yep. And if you want to relate to someone, food's the way to do it.
Oh, yes.
People eat. And so if you see a fire and you see a piece of meat on the fire, people will come to that fire and ask about, what are you doing? And it's a natural connection because we all know that you grill meat or you grill vegetables or you grill something, but everybody has seen a grill at work. And they ask you, did they cook out here like this? And you're like, yeah, they cooked on an open fire. And you explain the whole thing, and you show them the techniques and how to start the fire and what was involved with getting the meat that you're going to eat. And so it's this entire course on just a simple thing as just cooking a piece of meat. It can turn into this long discussion on cuisine. And it's one of those things that it makes that personal connection because that person that you talk to will leave and they will go somewhere else and they'll tell someone, I just saw somebody cook a piece of meat over an open fire and I learned why they did it that way. And then that person that they just talked to will now want to come see us cook that piece of meat. Mm-hmm. And so they'll show up and they'll ask questions. And it's this cycle of education. If you can educate one person and have them have a really good experience, they will go off and tell more people about how great it was, and we're able to share our message.
How many folks are at the Alamo now that actually fulfill those roles? Are there multiple people? Is it an all-volunteer group, or how does that program work in the first place?
Yeah, good question. So we have 7 living historians on staff right now, all in various capacities. But then we definitely rely heavily on volunteers as well. We've got a lot of volunteers who have been doing living history for a long time. And everybody does their research, and everybody's really bought into it. I mean, they will study down to the stitch what they need to be wearing. They will, a lot of times we talk about military history here, which makes sense, right? Given the history of the site. And so they will study the evolution of the firearm to the level that it's like, wow, you really learned this. You're really obsessed, perhaps. And it's awesome because then that passion just lends itself to these really rich discussions. So it's a small but mighty team. I mean, we do living history every single day. So like Ernesto was talking about, in the early seasons of living history here, it was just when he and a few others were able to do it for special events on the weekends, really. And we are so grateful that we get to do it every day now. And so I have, a lot of the same people in terms of volunteers coming back every week, and then the staff members, of course, as well, out every day. So it's a small but mighty team.
Are there different roles that they fulfill? Are there different, and I don't want to use a term that's not appropriate, but are there different characters or different types of individuals that are that you look to schedule to make sure that, if there's a certain event, you want to have a certain person doing a certain thing? I don't even know if I'm asking a question well, but you understand what I'm saying?
No, that's a great question. Yeah. So, there are some living history sites that get really specialized in, this person is in charge of blacksmithing, this person is in charge of agriculture, in charge of textiles. Here, we don't get specific in that way. We have certain folks who are depicting something very intentionally. So, for example, we have one fellow who is interpreting the New Orleans Grays, which was a group of soldiers that came here and were here during the battle. So he comes every day, that he's scheduled, of course. I wish I could have him every day. He's amazing. He has a very specific knowledge of that group. He wears everything that they were wearing. He has all the accoutrement, everything he's going to need to talk about that perspective. Now, not everyone gets quite as specific as him, but several of the staff members and volunteers do have kind of specific perspectives that they're prepared to talk about. But a neat thing about our staff currently is that everyone's pretty well-rounded. So they're not specialized to just one thing. Now, in terms of the character aspect, there are some living history sites that'll have you depict a particular individual. So that oftentimes is what you call first-person interpretation, and that means that you are taking on the persona of that individual. You are acting as that individual when you are on the ground. We do what's called third person here. So everyone who's here is not pretending like they were there in 1836, but they're using their knowledge of that era, but telling it from their, obviously they're a 2019 person. So they are themselves, but talking about these subjects. But we definitely play around with different types of interpretation, especially for some of our special events, particularly around commemoration, around when the battle happened. So we're always looking for ways to change up what we're doing, and we're always having people learn new skill sets so that they can kind of take command of a new type of information to pass on.
I am really thankful for y'all doing this, because I can't tell you how many misperceptions I didn't understand the terminology that we've talked about so far, and hopefully now a little bit more, but also just the whole idea of how it's done, and the value and the time, the effort that's put behind it. I mean, I know there's a lot there, but I did not realize the way it's done, and the fact that these, that people that are doing this are so personally invested in it, and it's really important, I guess, because they are teaching at the same time. Ernesto, when you're doing this, or do you still do this? I guess, or is this something that's in the past?
I do, but that is awesome. I still do it some.
Okay,
not as often as I once did, but I still do it, and it's you tend to find things that you really like to do, And if you love that aspect, you are more likely to want to tell people about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, our gentleman that does New Orleans Grace, he loves it to the point that he loves talking about the New Orleans Grace all the time. We have one that loves to sew, and so he does sewing, period sewing, so he can actually tell people what a tailor did. And so you have this, you find that niche that you like, and it really helps you teach because you love what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things I used to do is basically I would do a Mexican Texan, that role, or a Mexican soldier's role. And you explain things to people about the Mexican Army, about life in Texas as a native, and the impact of the Battle of the Alamo on the native population, which is, we think about the Battle of the Alamo, and you think about everybody that's inside the walls, but there's people that are outside the walls that are living in town mm-hmm. that have to make a choice. And you think about the choice: do you fight against your government and rebel and hope you win, or do you stay with the government? And it's one of those. This battle is one of those or the Texas Revolution in general, is if you're a native and you lose the war, you have no home. Mm-hmm. You have no place to go because you just lost your home. If you win, it's different. You create a nation, but people that are coming in from the outside, like from the United States and Europe, if they lose this battle and survive, or the war, I should say, they lose the war and survive, they can always go back to the United States or Europe. A native cannot go to his native land anymore. He's lost that. And so it's a big choice for the population of Texas. So that's the role that I would take on, is trying to explain to people the difference and how the choices that the men that were natives that chose to fight here at the Alamo made, it was one of those that was truly, it's all or nothing. Because if you lose, you have no home.
When I spoke with Dr. Winders a while back when we did the episode, and I had a great conversation. I learned a lot, and you're doing the same thing here, so I really appreciate that. One of the things he talked to me about was the different perspectives involved, and thinking about why the battle happened in the first place. So it's got to be one of the most gratifying things is when you see light bulbs go off over people's heads.
Many years ago, we had an exhibit on firearms that we put together, Dr. Winders, myself, and a few others. We put this really big exhibit on, and it was the evolution of firearms, basically focusing on how Texas was important to the evolution of firearms. And it was from flintlock to cartridge, and it ends in 1873 with the rollout of the modern cartridge as we know it. And so we had a hands-on table where at one point we even had gentlemen that loved doing cowboy shooting were coming in, and we trained them in the whole history of the evolution of the firearms, and they would spend hours talking to the public, showing the reproduction firearms and explaining how they all work. And at one point, Dr. Winders and I were out there, and we were running the table, and we had a visitor that stood there and listened to us talk for about 3 hours. And that's how we went over the same firearms over and over in those 3 hours, but she stood there. And when we finished the last time we had a break, she pulled Dr. Winders aside and she told him that she was from the Northeast. She had been deathly afraid of firearms, but she was not anymore because she understood how they worked, the purpose they were created for, how they were used on the frontier, how they evolved. And she said, "Thank you very much. I'm no longer afraid." And that one person, you reach somebody on an educational level. It wasn't anything about trying to, political views. It was just education. And she left with this understanding that made you feel good that you actually were able to teach somebody. School groups the same way. There's a lot of times that I would help with school groups, and we would go visit schools. And you go to some schools, and when you're explaining to them, the children, how things work, and one of them will actually raise his hand or her hand, and they tell you, "So if you do this part and this happens, this will occur." And one of them was like, when we were showing how a musket works. we didn't fire the musket, but we showed the part of the musket. And one student raised their hand and said, "Isn't that how you start a fire? With a piece of flint and a piece of steel?" And you look at them and you're like, yes, it is. It's the same technology. And it's incredible to see this, the connection that they were able to go from starting a fire to the technology on a firearm and be able to just understand it. It made a lot of sense. And it was one of those things that, you touch somebody on a totally different level. And it's just incredible. And when we would do some of these school groups too, you explain to them certain aspects of daily life, like shoes. If you had a pair of shoes, you took care of your pair of shoes. And you explain that, you can't go to Walmart. And so they all of a sudden look at you and they make the connection going, so then you take care of things because you can't get them really easily, right? And you're like, yes. So then they look at you and go, so clothing, you made your own clothing? And you explain, yes, you make your own clothing. And at that point, they start making these connections on a personal level, going like, so I should take care of my own stuff because if I don't, I might not be able to get more.
Yeah.
And it's funny because you're looking at like, well, yeah, you never know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the biggest things for me has been when people start to understand the reality of the battle itself. And so currently we've got a tour that the Living History Department does, and it mainly focuses on the weaponry used during the battle, but walks through the narrative of the battle and does so kind of in situ to where much of it happened. And I remember one of the tours I took initially with our wonderful living historian named Kate Dillard. She was saying to the folks on the tour, the magic of this place, or one of the magical things at least, is that the people here at a certain point knew that it was not going to turn out favorably, but the power is that they stayed here and stuck it out. And so the power, of course, the building itself is a wonderful symbol of so many things, and the building rather has inherent power. But the people are so much so like what makes this place magical. And so I think when we're able to really set out for folks like the actuality of what it meant for these guys and gals to be here, especially at that turning point when they all started to realize this wasn't going to turn out favorably. And then we ended up this last commemoration time having a group representative of the men who arrived from Gonzales. So, there are these 32 guys who march in, 31 are coming fresh. They hadn't been here. And, that the impact of even just watching, we had some guys come from Gonzales, and many of them were actually, descendants of these people these guys who marched in. So even just that power of that visual of watching them march in. And I know we had all sorts of people in the crowd that day for that event, and there was just something that took your breath away because, again, it's about people and the actuality of what was happening. And so anytime we're really able to that out for people, I mean, to me, that's so refreshing because it just keeps in my mind, like, no, this just isn't a grand story. This is a powerful, truthful history that happened here. We're just really privileged to be able to talk about it.
Everybody that's listening to this is going to think I'm the biggest geek in the world, but I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm getting goosebumps, with the picture of these folks marching in and, the relief on the face, I'm assuming, of the people that were within the walls thinking, yes, okay, we've got more resources. We're in good shape now, and not knowing necessarily what the future is going to hold or, anything. It's just, it's a human, emotional experience. And, that's the best thing that I can think of that living history would do is it puts you a little bit more in the moment through that interpretation, being able to ask questions and fulfill things in your own mind, create a full picture of whatever it is you're talking about. It's got to be a pretty cool privilege to be able to do that each and every day. we started off talking about Cannon Fest, so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and have you guys tell us, what is it? Why is there a festival for a cannon, so to speak, for people that don't understand, or even people that are listening? We've got people that are listening in different countries. But what is Cannon Fest, and how does it fit in with what you guys do?
Cannon Fest started a few years ago as a way to commemorate the Battle of Gonzales. The Battle of Gonzales is what sets off the Texas Revolution. And it happened in early October 2nd, 1835. And so Cannon Fest usually takes place the weekend closest to October 2nd. And our concept was show the importance of this event, but do it through the artillery pieces, because that's the reason that it happens. The Mexican army that's located at the Alamo is sent over to retrieve a cannon from the town of Gonzales that had been. Gonzales refused, and it ends up with a skirmish that will lead to the Texas Revolution. And so what we did was we found that we had an opportunity to teach people about artillery pieces. And we were able to do it through conservation at first. And so the Alamo has several cannon that are on display that are battle cannon. And at the time when we were starting this festival, it was in order to remember the conservation efforts that were being done. We had just received two cannon back from the conservation lab at Texas A&M, and we wanted to show off the restored cannon, or the clean tube, because they were clean. They weren't fully restored, but they were preserved. And so we had started this event, and it's continued ever since, as part demonstrations on how artillery works, to quick lectures on the artillery and the conservation portion. And people seem to really enjoy it, and we enjoy doing it. And so today we had them actually fire a real small load out of a cannon so that it's a blank, but to give people the understanding of how you load a cannon, how it fires, what the powder smells like when it burns, and the sound it makes. And people are drawn to that. They love that portion. And then we had the other side, which was, we had a lot of activities related towards cannons, but we also had 3 talks on artillery. And so we try to explain what was, why the cannons were here, how they got here, why they were here, what happens after the battle, and the conservation project, how it worked. And people seem to really enjoy it, because you get all the aspects, from the visitor that wants to sit and listen to a talk to the visitor that wants to see action. They had it all. And it's been enjoyable doing it. And so our living historians that we have out there are very passionate. We have men and women out there, some of which own guns, own some cannons that were willing to bring them in. And they love talking about their cannons. Yes. From one that's called the Degüello to the
Vicious Bunny. Vicious Bunny's here today.
And we also have Delilah.
And
so you have these 3 cannons here, and when you see the cannons, with the names like Vicious Bunny, it's what the artillerymen named their firearms, or someone named it when they saw it, and so the name sticks. And they're really, really happy to show off their cannon and talk about how it works. So we were lucky that they were all willing to come in and do this for us. And it's that part of that living history where they want to teach people about how things work.
And a cannon was a big deal. Artillery was something that the military typically had, and that was one of the reasons that the Mexican army, I'm assuming, wanted to get what they had back. And when you were talking about the names of these, I'm really hoping that Vicious Bunny has an Instagram page, because I've got to go find that.
I'm really afraid it's not, but I will suggest that to the owner.
Yeah, that would be amazing. That would be amazing.
It's funny because some of these cannon, you look at them, and when you hear the names, you don't really picture in your head what the cannon's going to look like. And when you see them, it's a totally different experience.
No, it doesn't matter if it's on the small side.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Cannon, no matter what size they are just powerful. I mean, you figure it's it's a metal tube shooting more metal out at high speed. It's going to be pretty destructive either way. So, yeah.
One of the things that I was doing today was talking to people, and we hear about cannon and how they fire metal, but the Spanish crew had a cannon that was here during when the Mexicans were occupying the Alamo, and the Texians had it as well after they took over the Alamo. But it's a pedrero. The cannon is called a pedrero, and what it is, it's a cannon that fires a rock.
Wow.
A round rock. Yeah, and you think about the cannons firing metal, and then you have one that fires a rock.
Yeah.
It's totally different. It was one of those things that I had never really thought of until I started working here.
Yeah.
And how a rock can be used as a projectile out of a cannon.
Yeah.
Well, and thinking about too, we had to do what you'd call like a reduced charge, so not quite as much gunpowder as what they normally would have used. And we just have one going off. And we actually do musket and rifle firing demonstrations each weekend, just using gunpowder, no bullets. And just thinking about the reality of how loud battles would have been, particularly here, that intensive fighting for 90 minutes or so on March 6th. I mean, it had to be loud. Smells aside, because it always smells very sulfuric after these things go off gunpowder, but it just had to be like deafening at points. So
that and that what I'm thinking about or picturing is the smoke. Because this was not the old smokeless black powder that they have nowadays. I mean, this must have been clouds and you couldn't see what was going on, necessarily in front of you. But you heard all of this and it had to be disorienting and, wow.
You can imagine it basically creates a fog.
Yeah.
So there's a fog over the battlefield because of all the smoke coming out of these firearms.
This is really something.
It's intense. You can see flashes, but that's about it at certain points.
I love listening to Ken Wise, who does a podcast called Wise About Texas, and he talks about what he calls the high holy days of Texas history in the spring coming up. But there's a lot coming up now, and the rest of the year. But what are some of the other events or big events where people can come and see you? Obviously, every day there are things going on with living history, as you said. But what are some of the highlights that maybe people can mark their calendars for?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for asking. So, of course, what people refer to as the High Holy Days will be here faster than we can even believe, towards the end of February and March. But before that, next month on October 12th, we have an event that I maybe not so cleverly have called Timeline of the Texas Revolution. So this is an event. It'll be on a Saturday, the 12th. Where I've invited some folks from other Texas Rev historic sites. And then we're just going to have kind of a wide swath of people all across our back gardens in almost little mini campsites talking about as many events as we can fit in with the Texas Revolution. So that's coming up in just a few weeks. We'll be trying to of course, do much to honor veterans for Veterans Day during that weekend in November. And we should be putting some more information about that out soon. And then in December, we have a reoccurring event for our very first Saturday where we talk about the holidays, but from a historical perspective. And we have quite a bit going on that day in regards to just like artisan products, things that people have made kind of using the historical processes. We'll have music as well, and some storytelling. It should be a really nice time. And then, of course, we'll be getting to commemoration very quickly here. It'll be February before we know it. So, yeah. So we've got some fun events coming up, but like you've said, we're here every day. Whenever people want to stop by, guarantee there will be something going on.
I would definitely encourage folks that are listening, if you've not been down to the Alamo, and talk to people that are doing this service for us. it's definitely something to do, and it's something to put high on a priority list. From the standpoint of just the opportunity to have this conversation, I want to thank you both for the time, especially today, because there's a lot of activity. I'm sure you guys have been busy the whole time. And then also just for investing what you have in your careers and your personal lives and your interest and your energy, because you've given a lot back to our community, not just San Antonio, but obviously to the whole state, and portraying what the history is of this place and how it affects so many people. I get into this mood sometimes when we're talking to folks that I'm really interested in the subjects, and I just kind of go on and on. So I'm sorry for doing that, but I do really appreciate the time.
For having us. I'm sorry you picked two kind of long-winded people.
Yeah.
So we're grateful that you wanted to talk with us today.
Oh, absolutely. Well, how do people find out more?
Yeah, so we have a wonderful social media guru here, really, who does a wonderful job of getting information out. So certainly on the website, thealamo.org, you're going to have an events page where it lists, well, really, we're pretty aggressive with it. So I think many months are listed out. And so there will be opportunities to kind of click through those calendar pages and find out more. But then we also have a very active Facebook page. And that is a great way to learn more about events. We make specific event pages and just put out necessary info via that outlet. And then on Twitter as well. We're always putting out info about what's coming up. So, yeah, we try to get the information out there as best we can.
Go out and look, folks, if you're going to go follow them, which I suggest, look for Official Alamo. So it's just at Official Alamo.
Yes, thank you. Yes, there are a lot of Alamo titled things in the world, so that is a distinction to make.
Yeah, I always start to search with an O, and you'll find the right one, because there are many others.
Yeah.
So don't tag the wrong one, guys. Tag these folks, because they need the recognition and they definitely deserve it. So thank you, Ernesto. Thank you, Angela, for being on Beyond the Riverwalk. This is a privilege for us, and it's definitely been a lot of fun. I'm hoping that we can connect again on new events down the road. And if you ever have anything that you want us to help share, just tag us out there on the socials as well, and we'll be sure to do that.
For sure. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.
So until the next time, we will see you around the Alamo City.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Beyond the Riverwalk. Send your comments, questions, and suggestions to podcast@beyondriverwalk.com. As always, subscriptions to our show are free and available wherever you find podcasts, as well as on our website. Until next week, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for more conversations about our community.